Yellowstone is a land of wonder. Geysers erupt with a force older than memory. Forests whisper to themselves in tongues no living man remembers. Rivers carve through stone as if the world itself were still being made. It is a place where beauty wears a mask. And those who stare too long into it sometimes find that it stares back. Most visitors never know what lies just beyond the tree line. They never see the places the trails don't mark. They don't hear the things that speak without sound. But there are some who stray further than they should. And there are a few whose job it is to bring them back. Like Daniel Rowe. Daniel wasn't just any rescuer. He was one of the best, sharp, experienced, unshakable. For years he had gone where others refused, pulled lost hikers from ravines, carried broken climbers down cliffs where helicopters couldn't reach. He knew Yellowstone's backcountry like a man knows the veins in his own hand. At least, he thought he did. The call came in late, too late. A lone hiker had vanished somewhere beyond the boundaries of Thoroughfare, the most remote part of Yellowstone, an unforgiving land, a place so deep in the wild that, even in the summer, snow sometimes dusted the higher ridges like a warning. The rangers debated whether it was worth sending a team at all. Too dangerous. Too many resources for too little chance. But Daniel insisted. He said no one deserved to be left behind. He gathered his pack, checked his maps, loaded his radio, and set off alone. No one thought it strange. He had done it a dozen times before. But this time, something followed him in. At first, it was nothing more than a feeling, a tugging at the edge of thought, a weight that pressed against the base of the skull, the sense that the trees were too still, that the fog didn't drift the way it should, that the silence had a shape, and that it was moving alongside him. Daniel pushed forward. He knew better than to listen to fear. He chalked it up to fatigue, to nerves, until he found the first clue. A torn scrap of fabric snagged high in the branches of a lodgepole pine. Too high for any man to reach without help. Too clean to have been there long. And beneath it, prints. But not the kind he expected. These weren't boot treads, not barefoot tracks either. Something in between. Long, wide, pressed deep into the soft earth as if carrying a tremendous weight. Daniel knelt beside them, tracing their outline with his gloved hand. He didn't understand what he was looking at. Not yet. The forest around him shifted then, as if something enormous had passed between the trunks, just out of sight. No sound, no movement. Only the overwhelming certainty that he was no longer alone. The radio crackled against his hip, though no one was speaking. Static hissed in his ear, the way it sometimes does before a storm, or before something older comes near. He tried to call it in. Nothing. Only that low, grinding hiss that seemed to claw at the edges of his hearing. Still, he pressed on, following the prints, deeper into the folds of the earth where the sun could no longer reach. Hours passed, or maybe days, time phrase when you're that deep into the wilderness. Daniel found the hiker's camp eventually, but not the hiker. The tent was shredded, not torn by a bear, not slashed in any way that made sense. The cuts were deliberate, surgical, precise in a way that suggested thought, intent. Inside there was blood, but only a little. Too little for someone to have died there. It was as if the person had simply been taken. Daniel felt it then, stronger than ever, a gaze pressing against him from the darkened woods. Something intelligent, something that understood it was being hunted and welcomed it. He left the camp at once, retraced his steps, or tried to, because when he turned back, the trail was gone. The landmarks he had memorized weren't where they should have been. The trees themselves seemed to have moved, leaning into him, thickening their ranks, cutting off the light. The prints he had followed now ran beside his path, as if shadowing him, mocking him. And that was when he heard it, a voice, faint, almost playful. It called his name, not shouted, not pleaded, just whispered. Daniel turned in circles, every hair on his body standing straight. The voice came again, closer. He ran. No compass, no map. Just raw, blind terror pounding through his legs. Something followed, something faster, something that knew these woods far better than he did. When Daniel stumbled back into ranger territory 3 days later, he was almost unrecognizable. Sunken eyes, torn clothes, mud crusted to his skin. He didn't speak for hours, just sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they held some fragile hope he dared not let go. When he finally told them what he'd seen, what he'd heard, they didn't believe him. At least, they said they didn't. But quietly, without ceremony. Daniel Rowe was relieved of duty. Officially, it was for mental health concerns. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. Something Yellowstone's officials didn't want to talk about. Because Daniel wasn't the first rescuer to lose something out there, and he wouldn't be the last. They say there are places in Yellowstone where maps lie, where the ground itself shifts to hide what lives beyond human sight, where something waits, old and patient, for the next soul foolish enough to come looking. And when it calls your name, you better pray you don't answer. Before Daniel Rowe's ordeal ever reached the public ear, there was another. Mark Holloway had been with the Yellowstone Ranger Service for over a decade. He was the man they called when situations were delicate, when a missing tourist could still be spun into a rescue, and not a body recovery. He was no stranger to strange calls, but this one felt different even before the phone stopped ringing. The dispatcher's voice was tight, clipped, almost as if she didn't want to say too much over the open line. Missing hiker. Solo traveler. Last seen 2 days ago, headed toward Shoshone Geyser Basin. There was one more detail. The area the man had wandered into was classified as restricted, not because of wildlife, but because the very ground itself was unstable. Boiling pools hidden under thin crusts of earth. Steam vents that could cook a man from the inside out if he stepped wrong. Mark packed light, extra water, a radio, a flare gun, the standard kit. He left word with his supervisor and started toward the basin before the sun had fully burned off the morning mist. The trails in that part of the park are faint, nothing like the well-worn tourist paths. Soon, even the faint markers faded away, swallowed by thick brush and drifting tendrils of steam. The Shoshone Geyser Basin is a place few ever see up close. Even fewer return with stories they're willing to tell. The air grew hotter with every step. The ground hissed beneath his boots. And then, the markers began. The first was almost easy to miss. A lone boot, sunk halfway into the mineral-crusted ground, melted, distorted as if the earth itself had swallowed it mid-stride. Mark stopped, staring down at it. No blood, no bone, just the boot, half consumed. He circled it carefully, testing the ground with his pole. Solid enough, for now. He logged the coordinates and pressed on. The forest thinned near the geysers. Trees stood at odd angles, their trunks whitened by sulfur. Most were dead or dying. But one thing stood out immediately. High up, almost 20 feet off the ground, deep gouges had been raked into the bark of a standing pine. Mark froze. He had seen bear marks before. This wasn't that. Bears leave uneven, frantic slashes, desperate, wild. These cuts were parallel, deliberate, too clean, and too high. No creature Mark knew of could have made them, not without standing on something, not without planning it. He raised his binoculars, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no birdsong, not even the buzz of insects. It was the kind of silence that pushes into the ears like pressure. like the world itself was holding its breath. Mark's radio crackled once, a brief burst of static. He paused, heart hammering against his ribs. The trees ahead leaned inward, strangely, forming a natural arch over a narrow path. Beyond that, the steam was thicker, almost opaque. Still, the tracks he followed, a broken twig here, a smudge of disturbed soil there, pointed forward. Reluctantly, Mark passed under the arch. The temperature rose sharply. The air smelled thick. Rotten eggs, damp moss, something else he couldn't name. The deeper he went, the worse the feeling became. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was the certainty that he was being watched. The certainty that he was not alone. Every few yards, he found more signs. A discarded backpack, untouched, half-zipped, no animal damage. A water bottle, still half full, perched carefully on a rock, as if placed there on purpose. Personal items scattered like breadcrumbs through the suffocating mist. It made no sense. Lost hikers panic. They don't leave a trail of neat, almost inviting clues behind them. Mark's instinct screamed at him to turn back, but duty was a heavy thing. He kept moving. Hours passed, or maybe more. The sun, hidden behind the mist and trees, gave no clear indication of time. Mark's water ran low. His radio remained stubbornly silent, except for the occasional low hum of static. And then, he found the clearing, a wide, flat expanse where the ground was bone-white and steaming. In the center stood something that should not have been there. A structure. No more than 6 feet tall, made of branches, stones, and what looked disturbingly like shredded pieces of clothing woven into the frame. It stood perfectly balanced atop the unstable ground, as if daring anyone to approach. Mark did not. Every instinct he had, every training session, every scrap of inherited wisdom from men who knew the wilderness better than he ever would, screamed at him to leave it alone. He took one photo, logged the location manually, and backed away, step by cautious step, until the mist swallowed the strange monument whole. As he turned, something caught his eye. Up the slope, barely visible between 2 leaning pines, a figure, standing motionless, too tall, too thin. Its limbs hung too long at its sides, almost dragging against the earth. Mark blinked, and it was gone. No sound, no movement, just the heavy, almost physical sense that the forest itself had taken a step closer to him. He didn't run. Not then. He made his way back, retracing his steps with a precision that bordered on desperate. And the forest shifted around him. The trail forked where it hadn't before. Landmarks rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. Once, he glanced over his shoulder and thought he saw the figure again, closer this time, still unmoving, still watching. Mark didn't stop, didn't think, only moved. Hours later, when he finally stumbled back onto a marked service road, he didn't radio in right away. He just stood there, breathing hard, listening, certain that if he so much as whispered, something would answer. Later that night, back at the ranger station, Mark filed the thinnest report of his career. Found minor personal effects, no subject, area unstable. Recommend no further search until conditions improve. He never mentioned the boot, the scars on the trees, the strange structure, or the figure, because in Yellowstone, some things are left unwritten, and some call-outs. He might want to leave a light on tonight, and maybe subscribe so you don't get left behind like the others. Mark Holloway might have made it back to the ranger station, but the Shoshone Geyser Basin hadn't let go of him, not completely. For days afterward, he felt it at the edges of his thoughts, like a splinter lodged too deep to pull free, a whisper against the back of his mind whenever he closed his eyes. But it wasn't until the radio crackled again that he realized He had never truly left. It was 2 nights later. Mark sat alone in the ranger outpost, staring into the dull green glow of the dispatch monitor. The other rangers had gone home for the night. The station creaked in the cool wind. All was quiet until the static began. At first, he thought it was just interference, common enough, this far from civilization. But then he heard it, a sequence of short bursts. 3, pause, 1, pause, 2. Mark stiffened. It was a beacon code, an old one, from the days before GPS trackers and satellite phones, a distress signal that hadn't been standard issue since the early 1980s. There was no logical reason he should be hearing it. The signal grew louder, the pattern repeating over and over. 3, 1, 2. Mark grabbed the receiver, heart hammering. "Ranger Holloway, copy," he called into the static. "Identify your call sign." No response, only the endless pulse of that outdated distress code, clawing through the frequencies like a voice that refused to die. Protocol demanded he report it. But something deeper, older, told him he had to go. He couldn't explain why. The next morning, Mark set out again, alone. No backup, no radio team tracking his position. Just him, the thickening mist, and the trail that led back toward the Shoshone Geyser Basin. Only this time, the land felt different. The ground, once merely unstable, now seemed almost hostile. Steam vents gushed without warning, leaving scalded scars in the earth. Pools that had been clear just days ago now festered with strange colors, sickly greens, bruised purples, deep oily blacks. And the trees were wrong. Some had been fossilized where they stood, the minerals from the geysers hardening their bark into stone mid-growth. Their twisted forms looked like figures frozen mid-scream, hands reaching upward toward a sky that had abandoned them. Even the plants closer to the ground seemed caught mid-movement. A patch of ferns, half turned to stone, their delicate fronds locked in place as if trying to flee some unseen calamity. Mark moved carefully. Every step sank into a crust that felt thinner, more brittle than before. And beneath it, something new. A sound. A low hum. Vibrations, just at the edge of hearing, buzzing up through the soles of his boots. He paused, crouching low, palm against the ground. The rocks, the very earth itself, was humming. Not from geothermal pressure, not from wind. This was something else. Something alive. Mark rose slowly, breath misting in the sulfur-thick air. Ahead, the mist parted slightly, revealing a dry wash filled with cracked mineral-scorched stones, and half buried in the rubble. Something glinted dully. He approached cautiously, eyes scanning the mist. The object was small, metal, circular. He pulled it free from the soil with gloved hands. It was a badge, old, corroded almost beyond recognition. But enough detail remained to see the faded letters S.A.R. Search and Rescue. Mark turned it over. Deep, jagged scratches ran across the surface, not scratches from age or corrosion. Then these were claw marks. He could see the way the metal had been gouged, as if something with tremendous strength had raked across it. The badge belonged to someone who had come here long before him and hadn't made it back. Mark closed his fist around it, feeling the cool metal bite into his palm. The beacon signal crackled faintly again from his belt radio. 3, 1, 2, only this time. It wasn't just static. A voice whispered beneath it, too faint to make out the words. But there was a rhythm to it, like a chant. Low, insistent. Mark backed away from the wash, every nerve screaming at him to retreat. But something was happening. The mist thickened unnaturally fast, swallowing the landscape. Figures seemed to move within it, too tall, too thin, flickering just at the edges of vision. The humming grew louder, deeper, vibrating his bones. And somewhere in that haze, something called to him. Not in words, in memory, in hunger. Mark stumbled blindly, trying to retrace his steps, but the terrain refused to behave. Landmarks shifted when he wasn't looking. Steam vents burst open in new places. Paths looped back onto themselves, folding space in ways no map could predict. Hours blurred, or maybe longer, until finally, Mark found a ridge of stone high enough to climb. From there, he saw it. Far below, nestled in the heart of the Shoshone Basin, a massive depression in the earth, perfectly circular, boiling with mist. And around its edge, structures, piles of stone and bone and branches, arranged with chilling symmetry, monuments to something older than the park itself, older than memory. Mark understood then. The missing weren't lost. They had been called, and soon, he would be too. He jammed the corroded SAR badge into his pocket, turned, and ran. Whatever was waiting in that mist, it wasn't finished yet, and it had already marked him. Mark Holloway didn't remember choosing where he camped that night. By the time the sun dipped below the mountains, the mist had thickened to the point that distance was meaningless. He could barely see more than 10 feet in any direction. The ground shifted underfoot. Mud, stone, then brittle mineral crust in random patches. It became dangerous to keep moving. He found a wide shelf of stone near a sulfur spring. The spring bubbled thickly, coughing up gas that reeked of metal and rotted things. But it gave off enough heat to keep the worst of the cold at bay. And more importantly, it kept the mist thinner. Just a little. He pitched his small emergency tent against the stone outcrop. No fire. Not yet. Not until he knew what else might be watching. The sky overhead bruised into deep, unnatural purples. No stars, no moon. The wilderness pressed in from all sides. Mark sat with his back to the rock wall, every muscle taut. He chewed a protein bar without tasting it. The radio on his belt remained silent except for occasional shallow pulses of static, like the dying breaths of a thing trying to speak. At some point, exhaustion won. He drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, curled inside the tent with his boots still on. The sulfur spring bubbled steadily just outside. Time lost all meaning. Until a soft sound, barely there. Brush. Mark's eyes snapped open. He lay frozen, listening. Brush. Something slid across the fabric of the tent. Not claws, not paws. It sounded like fingers, testing, tracing. The air inside the tent grew colder. The bubbling of the spring slowed, thickened, until it sounded like syrup boiling instead of water. Mark's hand crept toward his flashlight. Brush, brush. He held his breath. Waited. When he could stand it no longer, he thumbed the flashlight on and flicked it toward the tent wall. Nothing, no shadows, no sounds. Slowly, carefully, Mark unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The mist had retreated a little, forming a rough, trembling circle around the campsite. Beyond it, something stood. Just outside the reach of the dying firelight, he had managed to coax from a pile of damp kindling earlier that evening. Figures, dozens of them, motionless at first. Then one twitched, a sharp, jerking movement, a shoulder snapping too far back, a neck bending at an unnatural angle. Another figure shuddered forward a step, then another. The shadows moved wrong, not like people, not like animals, as if something was wearing a human shape and didn't quite know how to use it. Mark stayed perfectly still. The radio on his belt hissed once, sharply. One of the figures twisted toward him at the sound, its head lolled sideways. Then it began to walk. Each step bent the wrong way at the knee. Each arm jerked too high or swung too wide. More followed, slowly at first, then faster. They didn't run. They twitched toward him, stumbling with unnatural speed. Mark slammed the tent zipper shut and backed away, heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the bubbling spring. He grabbed the flare gun from his pack, loaded a round, and fired it straight into the sky. The flare burst, painting the clearing in harsh, bloody light. For one terrible second, Mark saw them clearly. Their skin was stretched too thin. Faces blurred, melted, featureless. Some bore tattered remains of clothing, park ranger uniforms, faded tourist jackets, even scraps of SAR gear. Their eyes, if they had eyes, were hollow, sunken pits. The flare guttered and fell. Darkness closed in like a fist. Mark didn't wait. He grabbed his pack, kicked out the small fire with his boot, and ran, blind, stumbling, heart hammering against his ribs. The figures surged after him, but the mist swallowed them quickly. Still, he could feel them there, following, tracking him through the poisoned air. The land itself seemed to shift underfoot, steering him toward places he didn't want to go. But somehow, instinct, or something older, guided him uphill, toward the fractured spine of stone he remembered from earlier. He didn't stop until he collapsed against the rocks, gasping, listening for the wet slap of footsteps behind him. None came, only silence. A silence so thick it pressed against his ears. Mark stared back the way he came, but the mist had swallowed everything. No fire, no tent, no figures. Only the sulfur spring continued to bubble somewhere below, coughing slow, fetid breaths into the night. He didn't sleep again. He sat there, back against the cold stone, eyes wide, staring into the darkness until the first gray fingers of false dawn bled across the mist. But even with the light returning, the feeling didn't leave him. He knew, with a certainty deeper than thought. Something was still following, and it was getting closer. Still with me? Good. Make sure you're following. Most people don't last this far into the woods. By the time morning clawed its way into the basin, Mark Holloway was barely standing. His boots were caked with sulfur dust and mud. His throat burned from breathing the poisoned mist. The mountains loomed, distant and gray, but every time he moved toward them, the landscape seemed to shift beneath his feet. Hours passed, maybe longer, until finally, through a gap in the mist, Mark spotted something that shouldn't have been there. A building, small, squat, almost swallowed by the trees. Its roof sagged under the weight of years. The wood was warped and cracked, the windows long shattered. It was a ranger cabin, but not one listed on any of his maps. Mark approached carefully, hand tight on the flare gun at his side. The air around the cabin felt different, still thick, still wrong, but quieter somehow, like the land was holding its breath. The door stood half open, groaning softly as it swung in the breeze. Inside, dust motes spun lazily through beams of weak sunlight, cutting through the broken roof. Mark stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Not rot, not mold. It smelled of stone and iron, old, dry, metallic, like the inside of a forgotten tomb. The walls were covered in pinned-up papers, faded, torn. He stepped closer. Missing person posters. Dozens of them, men, women, children, some yellowed with age, faces barely recognizable, some recent. Mark's stomach turned as he realized he recognized a few of the names. Tourists, hikers, campers, gone without a trace over the past 40 years. The air in the cabin was heavy, almost buzzing. Mark turned toward the far wall and froze. There, gouged deep into the wood with something sharp, were the words, "Do not trust the trees." The letters were jagged, frantic, some nearly cutting through the wall entirely. He ran a hand lightly over them. The scratches were old, but not ancient. Maybe 20, 30 years. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to warn whoever came after. Mark moved deeper into the cabin. An old desk sat against the back wall, partially collapsed under the weight of fallen debris. A leather-bound journal lay atop it, cracked and stiff with age. Mark lifted it carefully. Inside, the handwriting was cramped, hurried. The first few entries were simple field notes: weather conditions, trail, maintenance, visitor counts. Then, things shifted. April 12th, 1982. Heard the beacon again tonight. No one assigned to that code. Requests for clarification ignored. April 14th, 1982. Found another tree scarred too high. No known animals that size. Team says it's just weathering. They're wrong. April 16th, 1982. Lost another. Scott wandered off trail. Vanished. Found his boots. No tracks. No sign of a struggle. April 20th, 1982. Night patrol saw something in the mist. Wore Scott's jacket. Waved at them. When they approached, it ran. Wrong. Like it didn't know how legs work. The entries grew more fragmented after that. Short. Panicked. One word scribbled over and over. Mimics. And then, on the very last page, written in a trembling hand, it wears their faces. It knows their memories. It calls you by name. Beneath the final entry, a shaky diagram, the geyser basin, with a circle drawn deep inside a no-go zone. A place labeled simply, Nest. Mark closed the journal slowly. The wind howled suddenly outside, rattling the broken window panes. Somewhere out there. Something moved between the trees. A flicker of pale cloth. A hint of a face. Mark's blood turned to ice as a faint voice carried through the mist. Not a roar. Not a howl. A voice. Software. Calling his name. Mark. He stumbled back from the desk, knocking over the rotted chair. The cabin felt like it was closing in. The scratched warnings seemed to pulse in the dim light. Another whisper. Closer. Mark. Mark backed toward the door. He didn't remember drawing his flare gun, but it was in his hand. The journal. He stuffed it into his pack without thinking. He burst through the door, boots skidding on the slick ground. The mist outside churned violently, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw figures waiting at the edge of the clearing, hidden among the trunks. Watching. Waiting. Their outlines merged with the bark and branches. And he finally understood. The trees hadn't been carved by weather or animals. They had been hollowed, gutted, worn like skin. The forest itself was not safe. It was a mouth, a trap, a living thing that remembered every footstep, every whisper, every terrified breath taken inside its borders. Mark ran, the whispers trailing him like ghostly fingers tugging at his clothes. He had found the cabin. He had found the warnings. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Mark Holloway stumbled through the mist, the cabin vanishing behind him as if it had never been there at all. His legs shook from exertion and terror. Each breath tore through his chest like knives. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the forest itself was trying to drag him down into the earth. He didn't know how long he ran. Minutes, hours. Time lost meaning in that place. The mist thickened again until the trees around him became vague, towering shapes, shifting when he wasn't looking straight at them. He tried to focus, tried to remember the maps he had memorized, the ridgelines, the waterways, but it was useless. Nothing around him made sense anymore. Just as he paused to catch his breath, he heard it. A voice, faint, trembling, calling from somewhere deep ahead. "Mark! Mark, help! Please!" He froze, the blood drained from his face. It was his brother's voice, but that was impossible. His brother, Nathan, was 2,000 miles away. Safe. Working construction back in Arizona. Mark hadn't spoken to him in weeks. The voice called again, closer this time. "Mark, it's me, help me." The words were soaked in pain, desperation, panic. Mark's instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run back the way he came. But the voice, it sounded exactly like Nathan. Every inflection, every break, every memory layered perfectly into the pleading. Somewhere deep inside, a part of Mark, the part still tethered to hope, took a step forward, and then another. The mist seemed to pull apart ahead of him, revealing a faint trail. Footprints, fresh, leading away into the fog. Boot prints too large to be his own. They pressed into the soft ground, perfectly clear, as if someone had passed by only moments before. Mark followed. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear anything else. Every instinct fought against it, but he couldn't stop himself. The voice continued, floating on the damp air, closer, more desperate. "Nate?" Mark whispered hoarsely. "Nate, where are you?" No response. Only more footprints, leading deeper. He moved faster, boots slipping on the uneven mineral crust beneath him. The trail wound through blackened trees, past sulfur vents that coughed out heavy, choking gas. The world shrank to the narrow path ahead. Nothing else existed. Finally, the footprints led him to a break in the trees, a wide-open clearing. Beyond it, a cliff edge. Mark skidded to a halt. The footprints led straight to the edge and stopped. He crept forward carefully, boots grinding against loose stone. Peering over the lip of the cliff, he saw nothing but mist stretching below, endless, roiling, swallowing everything it touched. A fall here would mean certain death. There was no trail beyond, no handholds, no path, just empty space. The voice called again, this time directly behind him. "Mark ... He spun around. Nothing, only trees, mist curling low across the ground. And then he saw them, footprints, new ones, appearing in the soil, one step at a time, leading toward him. Mark backed up instinctively, heels scraping against the cliff's edge. He looked desperately into the mist, searching for anything familiar, anything real. And in the swirling fog, he saw shapes, dozens, maybe hundreds, figures made of mist and bone and memory, faces he half recognized, old SAR teammates, hikers from news reports, smiling tourists from missing posters. They called to him. Each voice layered atop the others, a chorus of desperate, pleading tones. "Mark, help us. You have to stay. You can save us. Just one more step." Mark's heart crashed against his ribs. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing the voices out. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He thought of the journal, the final warnings. It wears their faces. It knows their memories. The footprints stopped only a few feet away now. The mist boiled and writhed like something alive. Mark stepped away from the cliff, hands shaking violently. The moment he moved, the figures lunged, but not toward him. They surged forward, straight over the cliff, dissolving into the mist below. Gone. The ground trembled beneath his boots as if the earth itself exhaled. Silence fell again, deep and crushing. Mark staggered backward until the trees swallowed him once more, their bark groaning softly as they shifted. He didn't look back. Couldn't. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hunting him. And it knew him better than he knew himself. Mark didn't know how long he ran after the cliff. The landscape blurred into a suffocating maze of steam vents and blackened trees. Every step deeper into the mist seemed to sap more from him, like the earth itself was bleeding away his strength. Finally, when his legs could no longer carry him, He collapsed beneath a leaning pine, the bark cold and slick against his back. For a long time, he simply sat there, listening to the breathing of the forest, the whispering winds, the distant sighs of unseen things moving beyond the mist. In the heavy silence, a memory surfaced, unbidden but sharp. Something an old park ranger once told him during his rookie season. It had seemed like nonsense back then, a campfire story. But now, it felt more like a warning he had foolishly ignored. He could see the old man's face clearly, weathered, lined with a lifetime of sun and snow and secrets he never dared speak aloud in daylight. "You ever wonder why the tribe stayed clear of this land?" The ranger's voice had been low, almost reluctant, the kind of voice people use when they're not sure they should be speaking at all. Yellowstone ain't just hot springs and geysers. It's a lid, a thin skin stretched over something much older, something hungrier. Mark remembered laughing awkwardly at the time, thinking it was just another ghost story to scare newcomers, but the old man hadn't laughed. Not once. The Crow, the Shoshone, the Bannock, they all knew. They stayed to the ridgelines. They said the land underneath was broken, cursed. They called the vents breathing mouths. Said if you listen close enough, sometimes you don't hear steam, you hear voices calling you down. The memory sent a fresh chill through Mark's veins. Now, sitting alone in the heart of the mist, those words felt heavier, more real than anything he could explain. He shifted slightly, and his hand brushed against something in the dirt beside him. A carving, half buried under ash and mineral crust. Mark scraped it free, revealing a flat slab of stone, smoothed unnaturally by time and heat. Etched into its surface were strange symbols, worn almost to nothing, but still visible. Circles within circles, lines twisting downward, always downward, into something that looked like an open mouth. Jagged, wide, waiting. Beneath it a crude figure. A man, arms outstretched, being pulled headfirst into the gaping maw. Mark stared at it, the weight of realization sinking deeper. The geothermal vents, the pools, the geysers. They weren't just accidents of nature. They were openings, mouths, breathing holes, and whatever lived beneath Yellowstone wasn't content to stay buried. It needed to feed. The geysers weren't just water and steam. They were warnings, or perhaps traps. Mark looked up. The mist was thickening again, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns around the vents. He could almost see shapes in it, limbs, faces, twisted and stretched, as if clawing their way upward from the deep earth. The forest around him shifted subtly, the trees groaning, their limbs bending unnaturally toward him, like skeletal hands reaching out. And faintly, barely louder than the wind itself, he heard the voices again. Not pleading this time, chanting, repeating something in a language older than the soil beneath his boots. Mark scrambled to his feet, heart pounding against his ribs. He understood now why the ancient tribes had warned against this place, why they had refused to settle here, no matter how lush the valleys, no matter how rich the rivers. The ground was cursed, and the mist, the endless, shifting mist, wasn't just weather. It was part of it. A shroud. A lure. A veil to hide what fed in the dark. Mark stumbled backward from the stone, feeling the air grow colder by the second. The forest seemed to close in tighter around him, as if trying to herd him back toward the nearest vent, the nearest mouth. It would have been so easy to give up, to let the fog take him, to listen to the familiar voices and step willingly into the waiting dark. But something, some stubborn, ancient instinct, kept him moving, kept him breathing, kept him alive. For now. Still, as he disappeared back into the trees, the stone slab remained behind, half buried, its warning whispered into the mist. A story older than the park. older than the forests, older than the mountains themselves. A story of a land that had never truly belonged to the living. What do you think is down there, waiting? Hit that subscribe button if you're curious, or if you're already too scared to go alone. Mark's boots crunched across the brittle mineral crust as he stumbled deeper into the dying woods. Ahead, through the mist, he saw a flicker of light. A faint green pulse, mechanical, artificial. Hope sparked in his chest. Maybe someone else was still out here. Maybe he wasn't alone. He pushed forward, weaving through the skeletal trees. The clearing opened without warning, and there, scattered like broken toys across the cracked earth, was a search and rescue encampment, or what was left of it. Torn tents flapped weakly in the steam-laced breeze. Gear crates lay overturned, their contents strewn across the ground. Ropes, axes, emergency blankets, all dusted with a thin layer of ash. Mark's stomach twisted as he stepped closer. Dark stains mottled the ground between the wreckage, thick, dried, and blackened. Blood, lots of it, and dragging trails, long smears leading from tent flaps out into the mist, disappearing beyond sight. The camp had been ripped apart, not abandoned, not evacuated. It had been attacked. Mark's breath caught in his throat when he noticed the radio tower, a makeshift comms rig, still barely operational. The dish sagged to one side, cables frayed and sparking, but the emergency radio beacon mounted to it continued to blink and broadcast, a guttural, broken loop. Mark crept closer, the static growing louder with each step. At first, it was just garbled noise, but as he listened closer, he realized it wasn't random. There were screams buried in the distortion, actual voices, pleading, wailing, begging for backup that would never come. They're in the trees. Oh God, they're copying us. They're copying us. The voice dissolved into a high-pitched shriek before cutting out, replaced again by the endless crackle of static. Mark turned away, bile rising in his throat. Something horrific had happened here, and it wasn't over. He spotted a half-collapsed equipment case nearby, its lid hanging open. Inside, surprisingly intact, was a battered night vision camcorder, the green power indicator still weakly blinking. Fingers trembling, Mark lifted it. The last file was already queued up, frozen on a grainy, green-tinted frame. Against his better judgment, he pressed play. The screen flickered to life. Footage from the night the camp fell. The video wobbled violently as the operator, a SAR team member, sprinted through the trees, breath ragged and uneven. Shapes flickered at the edges of the night vision. Dark, tall shapes, humanoid, but wrong. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets yanked on invisible strings. The rescuer's panicked voice bled into the microphone. They're us. They look like us, but it's wrong. It's wrong. Suddenly, the camera swung around wildly. Mark caught a flash of something. A face emerging from the trees. At first glance, it looked human. Familiar, even. A man Mark thought he recognized from the missing posters pinned up in the ranger stations. But the way it moved, the way its joints bent backward, the way its mouth hung open too wide, the way its eyes glittered with a dead, glassy sheen. It wasn't human anymore. The figure charged the cameraman. The feed exploded into chaos. Shrieks, heavy impacts, snapping branches, and then darkness. The camcorder whined and stopped, the battery finally dying. Mark lowered the device slowly. The woods around him had grown impossibly silent. No wind, no animal sounds, not even the distant bubbling of the vents. Only the soft hum of the still broadcasting radio, looping its final broken message into the endless mist. He understood now. The missing hikers, the vanished rescue teams. They hadn't just gotten lost. They had been. taken, changed, used. The forest didn't just hide them, it wore them. Mark tightened the straps on his pack, forcing his legs to move again. He didn't know where he was anymore, how far he had wandered from the established trails. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He couldn't stay here. If he stopped moving, if he gave the mist a chance to catch him, he would join the voices crying out from the radio. Another face in the fog, another body for the forest to wear. And Yellowstone would swallow him whole, just as it had so many before him. Mark stumbled through the mist, heart hammering against his ribs, his mind clawing for anything, any clue that could help him survive what he was facing. The camp was long behind him now, swallowed by the hungry forest. But something had changed. The woods themselves seemed to shift subtly as he moved, as if they were no longer just scenery, but something alive, something aware. It was then, half blind in the mist, that he spotted it. Another cabin, smaller than the first one he had found, barely more than a shack. But it was real, solid. The door hung crooked on its hinges, sagging inward. Against his better judgment, Mark slipped inside. The air was stale and cold, untouched for decades. Dust blanketed everything, muting the outlines of battered furniture. In the far corner, an old footlocker sat wedged against the wall. Its lid was buckled with rust, but Mark managed to pry it open. Inside, beneath rotted canvas and a moldering parka, he found a journal. Leather-bound, stiff with age. When he opened it, the pages crackled like old leaves. Most of the writing was nearly illegible, smeared, faded. But 3 sentences stood out, written clean, clear, and deliberate in heavy black ink. First, do not answer if it calls you by name. Second, do not look in reflections. Third, do not follow the crying child. Mark stared at the rules, heart sinking. Whoever had lived here, they knew. They had understood what the mist was hiding and what it wanted. A sudden noise outside snapped him back to the moment, the sound of movement. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Mark slammed the journal shut and backed away from the door, but then he heard it. Clear as day. A voice, calling him from the woods, a voice that was impossible. "Mark, it's me, it's Dad." The breath caught in Mark's throat. His father had been dead for years, buried under Wyoming soil, far from this cursed place. But the voice was perfect. The tone, the warmth, even the slight rasp on the R. Mark closed his eyes tight, willing himself to ignore it. The first rule burned in his mind. Do not answer if it calls you by name. But the voice kept pleading, getting closer, more desperate. "Mark, please help me." Before he could stop himself, whether out of instinct, grief, or exhaustion, the words slipped out, barely louder than a whisper. "Dad?" The forest went dead silent. The mist thickened instantly, curling in through the broken doorway like living fingers. Mark stumbled backward, cursing under his breath. He had broken the first rule, and the forest knew it. The temperature dropped sharply. Every breath Mark took seemed to freeze inside his lungs. Shadows pressed against the broken windows, but it wasn't just darkness. It was shapes. Things standing just beyond the glass, watching, smiling. He turned, heart racing, desperate for another way out, and that's when he saw it. In the cracked, soot-streaked mirror hanging over the rusted sink, his reflection. But it wasn't right. His reflection smiled at him, a wide, unnatural grin stretching far beyond what his real face could make. Mark staggered back, breaking eye contact. But it was too late. The second rule shattered like glass in his mind. Do not look in reflections. The mist inside the cabin thickened into ropes, winding around him, squeezing. And then, came the sounds. First one, then two, then dozens. Voices, all of them his, laughing, crying, begging, repeating his name over and over in perfect hollow mimicry. Mark, 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 Mark. Each voice slightly wrong, each voice layered over the other until the air itself seemed to crack under the weight of it. He backed into the wall, desperate, hands over his ears. But it wasn't just voices. Through the gloom of the cabin, he began to see shapes forming, versions of himself, dozens of them, mirror versions, some younger, some older, all flickering like bad projections. Their movements were wrong, twitching, staggering. One lifted its head and smiled, the mouth splitting too wide, revealing teeth that gleamed like broken glass. Another began to crawl across the floor toward him, limbs bending in sickening, impossible angles. Mark squeezed his eyes shut, choking back a scream. He forced himself forward, shoving past the groping mist, through the half-hinged door and back into the night. The mist outside wasn't thinner, it was worse, and in the distance, carried faintly through the writhing fog, he heard it. The high, thin wail of a child, sobbing, lost, alone. Mark froze. The third rule echoed in his mind like a funeral bell. Do not follow the crying child. He had already broken 2 rules. He couldn't afford to break another. But the sound clawed at something deep inside him, the primal urge to protect. He took 1 step forward without thinking, and the mist seemed to part ahead of him, revealing a small figure standing just beyond the next bend. Tiny, hunched over, shaking with sobs. It looked up slowly, its face hidden by long, dark hair matted to its cheeks. But even from a distance, Mark knew, whatever it was. It wasn't a child. It had just learned how to sound like one. The figure raised 1 small hand, beckoning. Mark turned away sharply, forcing himself not to look back, not to listen. He ran, deeper into the woods, away from the cabin, away from the voices. And all the while, behind him, the copies of his own voice called out, fading slowly into the mist. But they didn't sound angry anymore. They sounded patient, as if they already knew. No one ever made it out of Yellowstone's heart once the forest chose to keep them. The forest felt like it was closing in around Mark. Every step he took, the trees seemed to bend inward, their crooked branches reaching down as if to drag him back into their suffocating embrace. The air was thick now, humid, dense, and every breath Mark took tasted like ash, like something ancient and burned. The world felt wrong. He had no idea how much time had passed since he ran from the cabin. It felt like hours, days, or perhaps only minutes, but the fog never cleared. The voices never stopped. He kept hearing the crying child, the soft, pleading sobs echoing through the dense mist. Every now and then, he would glimpse that hunched silhouette, always just beyond his reach, just out of sight. But this time, it wasn't just the whispers. It wasn't just the voices of the lost, calling out in distorted versions of his own. There were new sounds now, screaming, roaring, a cacophony of human and inhuman howls. Something large moved through the woods behind him, something fast, and it wasn't alone. Mark broke into a full sprint, fear flooding his veins. Every step he took, the ground felt as though it was giving way beneath him. The trees shook. The wind howled, tearing through the mist in violent gusts. The earth itself groaned with an unsettling noise, like something was waking deep below. He could hear them now, the things chasing him. Their steps were light, fast, too fast. They almost sounded like whispers, like the air was being torn apart. Mark's pack bounced against his back, every footfall pounding in time with the increasing roar of the storm. He knew they were gaining on him. He had to do something. He had to be found. He He had to be rescued, or he wouldn't leave this place. With shaking hands, he fumbled for his lighter and ripped open the small emergency flare pack he'd been carrying. His heart was pounding, his mind racing. He pulled the flare from its container and struck the lighter. The flare ignited with a hiss, flaring bright and blinding in the dark, mist-cloaked night. It lit up the whole of the woods around him, the fiery light sending jagged shadows crawling across the trees. Mark staggered back, holding the flare high above his head, trying to send a signal into the distance, into the thick fog. The moment the flare erupted, everything around him changed. The air trembled. The earth trembled. The howls, both human and animal, surged, suddenly deafening, as if the forest itself had been set aflame. Mark's legs felt weak. His chest burned with each breath, and then it came. From the woods ahead of him, a shape, a figure. It emerged, and Mark could barely comprehend what he was seeing. Tall, too tall, wider than any tree, its form shifting with the distortion of the mist, as if it wasn't quite part of this world. It moved like a predator, with a purpose. And in its wake, dozens more followed. Mark's mind could not process what he was seeing. Twisted, deformed things. Faces that were human, but wrong. Limbs that bent at impossible angles. Eyes that burned with a hollow, cold fire. They circled him. The flare sputtered and dimmed in his hand. Mark's breath came in sharp gasps. His pulse hammered against his skull. He was going to die here, alone. But then just as suddenly as the vision of horrors appeared, a new sound pierced through the madness. The sharp, shrill screech of a helicopter. Mark's heart skipped. He forced himself to tear his eyes away from the nightmarish things closing in on him, straining his ears to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The sound grew louder, closer. The rumble of a rotor blade splitting the mist. Mark's legs gave way beneath him, collapsing to the ground as he tried to focus on the sound of the chopper. He needed to be rescued, needed to hold on, even if his mind felt like it was breaking apart. Suddenly, bright beams of light flashed overhead. It appeared from the mist, a massive blinding spotlight cutting through the fog. The wind whipped up, scattering the low mist into the air. The rescue team had found him. They had come. But something was wrong. The moment the beams touched the ground around Mark, the forest screamed. It was no longer the eerie, distant howl of wind. This was something else. Something raw. The things in the trees, the shapes that had been lurking, those twisted, grotesque versions of his own voice. They shrieked now, and the air vibrated with the force of it. Mark couldn't hear himself. He couldn't hear anything. His mind was crashing. But the helicopter was close now. The rotor blades whipped the air violently as the rescue crew shouted orders. He felt someone grab him, pull him roughly into the open door of the chopper. And then, with an overwhelming roar, the helicopter took off. Mark barely registered the movement. He was numb, his mind full of static, his heart thundering in his chest. The mist below him began to recede, fading into the distance. The things in the forest, the copies, the shadowed horrors, were nothing more than flickers now, retreating as the helicopter climbed higher. And as the chopper rose above the trees, a deep, disturbing stillness settled in. The chaos quieted. The mist thinned. The forest seemed calm again. And Mark's world tilted, his vision blurred. The radio crackled. He couldn't focus on the words. His head felt too heavy. When he awoke hours later, disoriented and tangled in the straps of his harness, everything had changed. The rescue team was silent. They didn't speak of what had happened. They didn't mention what they found, and neither did Mark. But the worst part was this. When Mark sat up, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and glanced around at the team, he realized There was a gap, a hole. 48 hours were missing from his memory. The last 2 days, lost, gone, as if they had never been. Mark could remember the fear, the dread, the creatures, the flare, the helicopter. But those missing hours, he couldn't place them. And somewhere, deep in his gut, he felt that this wasn't the end. Because the forest didn't let go of you that easily. It never did. And whatever it was, whatever had followed him, had only just begun. The helicopter's blades cut through the air, and Mark could feel the steady pulse of its flight as it carried him away from Yellowstone, away from the mist and shadows that had consumed him. But when they finally touched down, when he stepped out of that chopper and back into the world he had known, something had changed. His mind was fractured, his memories twisted, but the world around him had remained the same. It was supposed to be a simple missing persons case, a routine rescue, a weekend assignment. But instead, Mark's life had come undone. The higher-ups were careful. They shuffled his report into a thick file labeled "mental breakdown," sealed tight with the red warning stamp. No one talked about what happened out there in the woods, not in any official capacity. The forest, the creatures, the voices, they were all swept under the rug. A casualty of too many hours in the wilderness, they said. Stress, fatigue, the pressures of working in SAR. The lines between reality and paranoia can blur, they told him. Mark was given no chance to explain, no chance to even ask the questions that burned in his mind. He was dismissed, a casualty of the job, just like the others before him. He was removed from search and rescue, ordered to stay home, to rest, to get better. But Mark knew what they weren't saying. Whatever had happened out there, in that cursed part of Yellowstone, whatever had followed him, had not let go. Days passed, weeks, months. But every time Mark closed his eyes, the same twisted faces returned, faces that were not his own, but versions of him, hollow-eyed and smiling. They stalked him in his dreams. The shadows followed him in the corners of his vision. The forest never stopped whispering. And then came the reports. It started slow at first. A few strange sightings, tourists visiting the park's restricted areas, talking about a man they saw, a man who looked just like Mark. But the eyes were wrong. They were black, empty, soulless. They wandered into places no one was supposed to go, places deep within the forbidden zones, places Mark had been warned not to enter. The same areas he had stumbled into that fateful day. Now, tourists were spotting this thing, walking the same paths, standing in the mist. One witness described it as Mark's double. They even got a picture. But there was no mistake. The eyes were black, hollow, devoid of life. The news spread like wildfire. The local parks department scrambled to contain it, but rumors couldn't be contained. The sightings increased. More people saw him, or what they thought was him. The same lanky figure, dressed in the same worn-out SAR gear, moving through the mist, with that same dark, empty stare. Mark tried to ignore it. He couldn't. Every new report gnawed at him. One night, after weeks of restless sleep and the unbearable quiet, he drove back to the park. He couldn't help it. He had to know. He had to see for himself. The forest was darker than he remembered, its twisted trees reaching out like claws in the night. He stood at the edge of the restricted zone, just outside Shoshone Geyser Basin, the very place where it all began. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy. It was as if the land itself had grown colder, more alive, more aware. And then, just as he thought he was imagining it, he saw something move. At first, it was just a silhouette in the distance. But as it stepped into the pale light of his headlights, Mark's heart stopped. It was him. It was his own face, his body, but his eyes. They were black, black as coal, and they were locked on him. Mark froze. The figure tilted its head slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it wasn't quite in control of itself. The thing took one step forward, then another. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine, something deep and primal warning him to run. But before he could move, before he could even take a step back, the figure raised its hand. And that was when Mark saw it. Behind its eyes, behind the darkness, there was something else. Something familiar. The way the figure moved, the slow, deliberate way it approached him. It mirrored every movement Mark made. It was as though it was him, but not. Not anymore. His heart hammered in his chest. He reached for the door handle to his truck, but he couldn't bring himself to turn it. The thing, the other Mark, took another step forward, and for the first time, Mark realized the truth. The forest had never let him go. Whatever was stalking him had followed him home. That figure in the mist, that thing, wasn't a person. It was something else, something that wore Mark's face. It stepped closer to him until it was just a few feet away. Mark stood frozen in place, staring into its eyes. Those empty, soulless eyes. And he understood. He wasn't the only one to leave the woods that day. The forest had taken something from him, something that would never return. The figure smiled, its lips stretching far too wide, and Mark knew then that this was just the beginning. Yellowstone, once teeming with life and the thrill of adventure, has grown quieter now. They say that some places change over time, that they become less familiar, more distant. But Yellowstone, no, it's not the same, not anymore. The park has quietly closed parts of its wilderness. Sections once open to the public now sit behind barriers with signs warning of hazardous conditions and unexplained phenomena. But no one talks about what happened in those places. Not publicly. Not to the visitors who keep arriving, unaware of the danger lurking in the steam. New SAR trainees arrive every year, eager to follow in the footsteps of those who risk everything to save lives. They receive their handbooks, thick, weathered tomes filled with instructions, protocols, and emergency procedures. Most never read them. Most skip the pages they don't want to know about. The pages that warn them. Do not trust the trees. The words are there, printed in faded ink, but they're always ignored. Perhaps they think it's just a joke, an old superstition. Maybe they think it's just a precaution, a remnant of old folklore. But they don't know. Not yet. Not until it's too late. Because some of them, like Mark, will disappear into the mist. And some of them will see the eyes, the black, soulless eyes that were never meant to be seen. There are whispers in the steam now, faint voices carried by the wind that still rises from the geothermal pools. They're not human voices, though. They're deeper than that. Older. They hum with an otherworldly cadence. Some say it's the forest speaking. Others believe it's something worse. Something that has learned to mimic the living, to wear their faces, their memories. The park remains open. Visitors still wander its trails. They hike through the mist. They take photos of the geysers. They don't know the truth. They don't know what's hiding beneath the surface. But the forest does. And the trees. They never forget. Mark Holloway is gone. His name, once spoken with respect, now fades into the past. But there are others, new faces, wandering into the same forbidden zones. Others who won't return. Others who will become part of the whispers. And that's the way it will always be. So remember this. Some forests don't want you to leave, and some never let you go. If you made it to the end, you're one of the lucky ones. Before you forget what you heard here tonight, follow MindFuel, subscribe, and remember, some forests don't want you to leave, and some never let you go.